I'm Callista.
And I'm Teresa, and this is Terrifyingly Typical True Crime.
We're finishing our theme of Daughters Who Kill with one final case, this time with a historical case, one that even has its own rhyme. That's right, today we're talking about Lizzie Borden. Lizzie Borden took an axe and gave her mother 40 whacks. When she saw what she had done, she gave her father 41. Catchy, but not exactly accurate, because allegedly, and we have to say allegedly because she was acquitted, Lizzie killed her stepmother, not her mother, and she killed them both with a hatchet, not an axe. On top of all that, Abby Borden, Lizzie's 64-year-old stepmother, was struck 19 times, and Lizzie's father, 69-year-old Andrew Borden, was hit 10 or 11 times in the face only an hour and a half later.
But the truth doesn't rhyme.
And we should always favor a pretty lie.
Always. These murders were so gruesome that they not only became the most notable crime of New England's Gilded Age and fascinated the press across the country, but they also caused some to believe Jack the Ripper had crossed the Atlantic to commit them himself. What actually led up to the brutal murders in Fall River, Massachusetts on August 4th, 1892, and how did the person people still think is guilty get off? Let's get into it. 50 miles from Boston, Fall River, Massachusetts had a population of 74,398 in 1890 and was known as a prosperous textile mill town at the time. As for the Bordens, Andrew Jackson Borden was born in 1822 to Abraham Borden and Phoebe Borden. He became both rich and influential due to his investments in real estate, local textile mills, and banks. He was also the Union Saving Bank's president and served as director of various corporations in Fall River.
In spite of his wealth, he didn't live lavishly. You only had to look at his house at 92 2nd Street to see that. This house, known as the Andrew J. Borden House, was in the Greek Revival style and was built in 1845 and purchased by Andrew on April 26, 1872. Described as modest, its main downfall was the location, in one of the many working class neighborhoods located only a block away from the town's business district, and not on the land known as the Hill, an enclave for the town's wealthiest, so named because of its higher elevation.
And that continues today. The wealthy neighborhoods are always on a hill or a ridge.
That way, those poor people can literally look up to them. Andrew's first wife, Sarah Anthony Borden, was born in 1823 in Somerset, Massachusetts, to Anthony and Rhodey Morse. She and Andrew married on December 25th, Christmas Day, 1845, and had 3 children together. Emma Lenora in 1851, Alice Esther, who lived from May 3rd, 1856 to March 10th, 1858, and reportedly died from hydrocephalus, the buildup of fluid in cavities of the brain, and Lizzie Andrew in 1860. Sarah died in Fall River in 1863 from uterine congestion and spinal disease at the age of 39.
God, how painful. And she was so young.
I know. Side note, I couldn't find a disease called uterine congestion, but I think its modern day equivalent is pelvic congestion syndrome, which features pelvic pain that results from faulty veins in the pelvis and ovaries that can become contorted and overfilled. This surplus of blood can pool in the pelvis and, unsurprisingly, be painful. One possible risk factor is having had more than one child, as most women in this period would have done.
Yeah, I actually looked it up and I found that too. Interesting. Andrew's second wife, Abby Dufree Borden, was born in 1828 to Oliver and Sarah Gray. She married 43-year-old Andrew when she was 37 on June 6, 1865.
And so far, I'm rather impressed with the relatively minor age gap between Andrew and his wives, given the time.
I was thinking the exact same thing. Abby became the girl's stepmother when Emma was 14 and Lizzie was just shy of 5. Abby, who was reportedly short and had few friends.
What defining characteristics by which to later be known?
I mean, I suppose that is better than some man saying she was short, plump, homely, and unsociable.
Yeah, I did see a less kinder adjective used to describe her, but I chose not to include it.
Yeah, I can imagine. Abby, by no accounts, treated Lizzie and Emma poorly. However, it is likely that neither was thrilled to have a new stepmother only a couple years after the death of their own mother. And Emma apparently would not call Abby mother, which, at least today, seems pretty understandable. By the time of the murders, 32-year-old unmarried Lizzie lived at home but dreamed of moving to the Hill. This dream was all the more infuriating because Andrew could afford to move the family from a neighborhood quickly filling with Catholic immigrants. His frustrating frugality was further evidenced by the home's minimal gas lighting and indoor plumbing, with running water having only been installed for two faucets in 1874. And Lizzie wasn't simply spoiled in wanting more. These were conveniences to which the wealthy in the 1890s were accustomed. Unsurprisingly, Lizzie wasn't the only one to begrudge her father's penny pinching. Emma Borden, Lizzie's 41-year-old sister, also unmarried and living at home with Lizzie, Abby, and Andrew, similarly wished for a more lavish lifestyle. Wanting indoor plumbing when you can afford it in no way seems unreasonable to me.
It definitely doesn't. But Andrew planned on spending his money on other things. He was going to help Abby's half sister, Sarah Whitehead, purchase a house in Abby's name. I think it's safe to say that the Borden sisters would have been less than enthusiastic about that. On the day of the murders, August 4th, 1892, five people were staying in the Borden house: Lizzie, Abby, Andrew, Bridget Sullivan, who was their 26-year-old servant, and John Morse, who was the younger brother of Lizzie and Emma's late mother, Sarah. Who was Bridget Sullivan? She was born in 1866 to Eugene and Margaret Sullivan in County Cork, Ireland. She came to New York City on May 24th, 1886, aboard the SS Republic. And thinking of that presumably harrowing voyage, I pictured Saoirse Ronan in the movie Brooklyn. Love her, didn't love the movie. Anyhow, Andrew hired Bridget in November 1889, and she was referred to as Maggie by Emma and Lizzie.
As for Lizzie and Emma's uncle, John Vinicum Morse, was born in 1833 to Anthony and Rhodey Morse and lived until 1912. Born in Fall River, when he was around 20, John left Massachusetts for Minnesota, then later moved to Iowa. But every summer, he came back to Massachusetts to stay in New Bedford and Fall River. Now that we have the groundwork laid, let's get to the day in question. After waking in the guest room on his first and only day in town, John had a breakfast of coffee, Johnny cakes, fruit, cold mutton, and mutton soup with Abby and Andrew. John then went to go see other relatives across town around 9 a.m. At that same time, Andrew left to go see a few of his buildings in the business district, and Abby made her way to the guest room to clean.
Lizzie had come downstairs around 9 after breakfast was already over. Lizzie claimed to have been ironing in the dining room while Bridget had been washing the exterior windows when Abby was killed in the guest room on the second floor at approximately 9:30 a.m. Even though Lizzie was below her, she claimed not to have heard the 200-pound Abby fall to the floor between the bed and a bureau. Lizzie said that Andrew came home around 10:45 a.m., said hello to Lizzie and Bridget, then went to have a nap on the couch in the sitting room. The medical examiner determined that only 45 minutes after his arrival, Andrew also lay dead. Bridget, having only gotten in from a night out around 10 the previous evening, had been resting in her third floor attic room while Andrew was murdered in the sitting room on the first floor.
According to Lizzie, she hadn't heard a thing during the murders and only learned what had happened when she entered the house late that morning from the barn and found Andrew's body. Lizzie then called Bridget from her room on the third floor and ordered her to Dr. Bowen's, who was the family physician whose house was across the street. Bridget raced back to the Borden house to inform Lizzie that Dr. Bowen wasn't at home. So Lizzie told her to collect a friend who also lived on the street to help, rather than asking Bridget to call upon the man who lived next door, an Irish immigrant doctor with an advanced degree who also worked as the city physician. This widespread stigma toward outsiders, which only grew in proportion with the rapidly expanding Fall River immigrant population, didn't only extend to European workers because Lizzie also never requested the help of the French Canadian doctor who lived behind the Borden's home. Would it really matter what nationality a doctor is when someone has been mortally wounded?
Of course it wouldn't, but I'm sure they thought that those foreigners probably don't know what they're doing. Xenophobia is nothing new. While these prejudices didn't help Andrew and Abby, they did initially help Lizzie. Because no one from Lizzie's upper class thought she, a central congregational church Sunday school teacher, would have dinner to kill her parents, an idea that will pop up again later on. After the bodies were discovered that morning, all that the general public knew was that the deceased had been killed in broad daylight and that no one on their busy street had heard or seen anything out of the ordinary near the Borden property. Later on the day of the murders, Dr. Bowen, the family physician, sent a telegram to Emma to inform her of the deaths, and together, she and Lizzie put up a $5,000 reward for information. With a significant amount of money up for grabs, rumors swirled about a disgruntled tenant who harbored ill will towards Andrew. The police, believing that the violent murders had been committed by a foreign man, ultimately chose to act on yet another rumor that pointed the finger at a farm laborer who had emigrated from Portugal and had previously worked for the Bordens in Swansea, Massachusetts, arresting him only hours after the murders.
I mean, of course it must be a poor immigrant.
It couldn't possibly be one of us. I'm so glad that mentality has completely gone away. JK.
But the belief in Lizzie's innocence began to change when Lizzie's answers to the police did. Like we've never heard that before.
Mhm.
Due to the many Irish immigrants who had joined the Fall River police force, Irish police officers were the ones to secure the Borden property and interrogate Lizzie in her bedroom. While Lizzie originally said that she was looking for iron to use for fishing sinkers in the loft of the barn, she then changed her story to say she was up there having pears. With temperatures rising to the 90s that August day, few could understand why anyone would want to hang out in a barn loft. Lizzie also claimed that Abby had left after receiving a messenger that morning, but no one was able to confirm this.
Beyond these inconsistencies and her lack of any tears, I mean, really, how unfeminine.
She must be a cold hearted bitch.
Undoubtedly. She had attempted to buy prussic acid, a poison also known as hydrocyanic acid and hydrogen cyanide, from a drugstore the day before the murders. The woman seen attempting to buy the prussic acid claimed she wanted to use it to create an edge on a cape made of sealskin, something Lizzie owned. But because prussic acid had to be obtained with prescription and the drugstore clerk, Eli Benz, had never heard of that use for it, he hadn't sold it to the woman. Fuel was only added to the poisoning theory fire when a story about Abby, Andrew, and Bridget having had stomach problems earlier that week started spreading. At the time, Abby had called Dr. Bowen asking if they could have been poisoned. Having spoken with both Andrew and Abby, the family physician decided that their digestive problems were a result of having eaten leftovers for dinner the prior night.
I wonder if that was some of that yummy mutton soup.
I also assumed that even the name is just super appetizing.
So much. By Saturday, August 6, 1892, which was the day Andrew and Abby were buried, it wasn't just Fall River residents who were captivated by the brutal killings. The gruesome details were making headlines all across the nation, despite some Massachusetts people that live in Massachusetts firmly believing in Lizzie's guilt. Several newspapers and feminist organizations saw her as a victim of incompetent policing, a calamity made all the worse by the death penalty sentencing on the table, which would make her the first woman to be executed in Massachusetts in over a century, the last having been put to death in 1778. Nonetheless, the recently elected mayor, John W. Coughlin, Fall River's second Irish mayor, also owned the newspaper, the Fall River Globe. And this working class Irish paper had a habit of attacking the city's wealthy mill owners. It was no surprise then that after the murders, the paper found a new wealthy target, murderess Lizzie Borden, reporting that her relatives who lived on the hill were gathering millions of dollars to prevent a conviction. However, the Hill's periodical, the Fall River Evening News, was staunchly defending her. As for legal proceedings, authorities held an inquest 5 days after the bodies were discovered. This inquest lasted 3 days, and Lizzie testified in court every day, something she would not repeat during her trial.
While Lizzie had no defense lawyer throughout this closed inquiry, Dr. Bowen, a firm believer in her innocence, provided a reason for the previously mentioned inconsistencies in her story, stating that he had given her a double dose of morphine after the bodies were discovered to allow her to sleep, a side effect of which was confusion. He added, I do not believe a hardened man of the world, much less a gentle and refined woman in her sober senses, devoid of sudden passion, could strike such a blow with such a weapon as was used on Mr. Borden and linger to survey the bloody deed. In spite of the doubt around Lizzie's homicidal competency, only 1 week after the double murder, Lizzie was arrested on August 11th, 1892, and was sent to the county jail and the 9.5 by 7.5 foot cell waiting for her, accommodation she would become used to in the many months to come before her trial. After Lizzie was arrested, women's groups such as the Women's Christian Temperance Union and the suffragists protested that because women could not serve on juries, her right to be judged by a jury of her peers would be violated.
And thanks to her social standing, one of Boston's most important defense attorneys teamed up with the Borden's family attorney to defend her during her preliminary hearing. The tiny courtroom located above the police station was bursting with her supporters, including female residents of the Hill. This support didn't mean Lizzie was out of the woods, though. Neighbors and family members who spoke to newspapers and police said that Emma had been visiting friends 15 miles away for the past 2 weeks, meaning that only Lizzie and Bridget had been with Abby after Andrew had gone to make his business rounds that morning. Police later discovered him lying on the couch. Having been bludgeoned, his face was left unrecognizable. That Andrew was the second victim was more than clear. His body was discovered so recently after his death that his wounds were still bleeding and his body wasn't yet cold. By contrast, Abby's wounds were covered in dark, thick, coagulated blood, and her body had lost its warmth.
But apart from near the bodies, no blood was found anywhere else on the property. As for Lizzie herself, the supposed killer, the underdress she had on the day of the murders that she handed over to the police 2 days later had only a 1/16 inch size droplet of blood on its hem. When Lizzie had been standing by the side door of her home and told Adelaide Churchill, Andrew, about the murders shortly after they occurred, Adelaide, the Borden's widowed next door neighbor who was a single mother to son Charles, immediately came over and didn't spot a speck of blood on Lizzie. This side door, incidentally, was the only unlocked door, as the back door had been locked and the front door had all three of its locks engaged. Despite the suspicious lack of blood on the prime suspect, after Lizzie pleaded not guilty, she was jailed in Taunton, a city 8 miles from Fall River, before coming back to Fall River for the preliminary hearing on August 22nd, which started on August 25th, 1892, and ended 7 days later.
Both the district attorney and the attorney general, who would get involved in any capital cases, believed she was guilty. So the district attorney chose to convene a grand jury on November 1892. 23 jurors heard the case, but court proceedings were suspended with no action being taken. But on December 1st, the testimony of 40-year-old lifelong Fall River resident Alice Russell, Lizzie's friend and member of Central Congregational Church, was heard. This was the friend Lizzie had sent Bridget to collect instead of the nearby Irish immigrant doctor. Following the discovery of the bodies, and while they still lay on mortician boards in the Borden's dining room, Alice stayed at the Borden home for numerous nights with Emma and Lizzie. Alice had previously given testimony, but she had stayed quiet about something.
With this secret eating away at her, Alice spoke to a lawyer who urged her to speak to the district attorney. And on December 1st, Alice told the grand jury that on the Sunday after the bodies were discovered, the day after Andrew's and Abby's funerals, Lizzie had taken a dress she had stowed on a shelf in the pantry and thrown it into the cast iron coal stove in the kitchen. With that, Lizzie was indicted the following day because why else would she burn a dress unless it was covered in the blood of her victims?
I mean, maybe she spilled some mutton soup on it and couldn't get the smell out, or Maybe when she got close to her murdered father, she got blood on her dress, and then because she didn't want to look guilty, she simply stored it on a shelf in the pantry.
Those are both more than possible, but that's not what most people assumed. Coming back to Emma and Lizzie staying in the house after the murders, would they have done that if they believed Abby and Andrew had been killed by someone else who broke in? It does seem to indicate that they both knew Lizzie was the killer and that they were in no more danger there than they would have been anywhere else.
Nonetheless, Emma tried to cement her sister's innocence by saying that they had no ill will towards Abby. Despite the sisterly devotion and the applause following Lizzie's defense lawyer's closing argument at her preliminary hearing, add on the stories of suspected poisoning earlier in the week and Lizzie's attempt to buy prussic acid, and the police marshal, judge, and district attorney all decided she was probably guilty. With that, the judge decided she would remain in custody until a state superior court trial could take place. But some still weren't eager to prosecute. In fact, the attorney general left the case in April 1893 after having been ill and having his doctor claim that his health would not permit him to take part in Lizzie's trial. Instead, he chose a district attorney who lived north of Boston to lead the case, with the Bristol County District Attorney, Hosea M. Knowlton. Sorry.
On June 5th, 1893, Lizzie's trial began in New Bedford Superior Court. Reporters from all over the U.S. had come to cover it, and those waiting to get in were willing to spend hours in line. Many of the people waiting in line were women who were fascinated with someone who had so violently violated the gender norms that had been forced upon them. During her trial, a chemist from Harvard University stated that no blood was discovered on the two hatchets and two axes police collected from the home cellar. But in this basement, lying in a box of old tools, was a hatchet head with only part of the handle attached. The handle of the handleless hatchet, as the infamous weapon would later be known as, sported a fresh break and had what seemed to be a coating of ash on it. The 3.5-inch blade matched the injuries on Abby's and Andrew's bodies. Why was it covered in ash? It's possible Lizzie used the hatchet, rinsed it, put it in ash to get rid of any remaining blood, then threw it in the basement among other junk after her first choice of prussic acid didn't pan out.
Even though police also found blood soaked rags in a bucket in the washroom in the cellar, Lizzie said that these were the result of her period. And at the time, no one was going to ask any more questions about that. Oh my God, no. In spite of counting the bloodstains, tearing up sections of carpet, and searching everywhere anyone could think of on the Borden property, this case was a perfect storm of rudimentary forensics, and a contaminated crime scene. Contaminated because the police hadn't been the only ones walking around the Borden house following the murders. Neighbors, doctors, reporters, and random passerbys all had their chance to disrupt the crime scene. Nonetheless, the prosecutor opened with the fact that Lizzie was the only one with both the motive and opportunity to kill Andrew and Abby, finishing his statement by stating that he had their skulls in his possession, at which point Lizzie fainted.
Over the course of the following week, the prosecution presented their witnesses, spelling out that Abby being murdered first meant that Lizzie and Emma inherited everything. Whereas if Andrew had been the first victim, part of his wealth would have gone to Abby's family. Now the skulls come back into play because the prosecution fit the handleless hatchet into them to show that the injuries were consistent with it. Medical experts claimed that a woman with ordinary strength would have been able to yield the hatchet to kill Abby and Andrew. It's also important to note that a hatchet, as opposed to the axe from the rhyme, is both less heavy and less awkward for someone of a smaller stature to swing around. Sure of Lizzie's guilt and worried he would be unable to secure a conviction, Hosea Knowlton gave a 5-hour closing argument, hoping he could secure a hung jury and could take Lizzie to trial once again if new evidence was discovered.
It seems that courtroom theater was alive and well back then. Can you imagine a 5-hour closing argument?
You have to think that when it gets to that length, the lawyers already made all of their points, so they now are simply doing it to hear the sound of their own voice.
Yeah, talk about like grandstanding.
Oh, yeah.
But the DA had not fully understood the cultural challenges he had to contend with. Lizzie's defense team, however, used them to their advantage as soon as the prosecution rested their case. Told to dress in black, Lizzie came to court in a tight corset, loose clothing, with flowers and a fan in her hands. To the men in the courtroom, she was the picture of fragile femininity. One newspaper wrote that she was modest and well bred, not a brawny, big, muscular, hard faced, coarse looking girl capable of murder, let alone able to crack a skull. You've really got to love men's constant ability to diminish what a woman can or can do based on her social status and appearance.
But we can tell everything about someone by looking at them. I mean, that's always true.
My. In contrast to the 9 days it took the prosecution to present their case, the defense spent only 2 days relying on witness testimony to establish reasonable doubt based on the lack of evidence and the narrative that Lizzie was simply a woman embroiled in a tragedy compounded by the fact that she was being blamed for a double murder she had no hand in.
Having inherited Andrew's wealth and his assets upon his death in 1892, including the commercial building he had built on South Main Street in the Victorian style 3 years earlier, called the A.J. Borden Building, Lizzie secured the best legal team she could. One that included a former Massachusetts governor who had previously selected one of the three justices on her case. While all the justices helped her case, such as by excluding testimony that discussed the prussic acid because the prosecution had failed to contest its innocent purposes, the justice handpicked by the governor delivered what one newspaper called a plea for the innocent. Even if Lizzie's defense hadn't done their due diligence, refuting every point brought up by the prosecution, the culture of the time could not conceive of a Protestant nun murdering her family. This term, Protestant nun, which was used by the Temperance Union's national president, referred to New England women born in the late 1800s who never married. While it was still preferable that a woman married and had children, the idea of a woman obtaining an education and becoming independent was less offensive than it had once been. An idea helped by the founding of four historic women's colleges in Massachusetts between the 1870s and 1890s.
Emma also met the definition of a spinster, but Lizzie was involved in various social and religious activities, which included being a member of the Fall River Hospitals Board and being involved with a Sunday school promoting Christian endeavor, not to mention her affiliation with the Temperance Union. So, civic minded and God fearing, Lizzie was the one to become an informal Protestant nun who couldn't possibly have killed two people. As for the piece of evidence that had led to Lizzie's indictment, Emma told the court that she had been the one to tell Lizzie to burn the dress for an innocent reason. Lizzie herself never took the stand. However, after closing arguments were heard at the end of 3 weeks of trial, Lizzie left the jury to make their decision with her voice echoing in their mind. She said, "I am innocent. I leave it to my counsel to speak for me."
Because Fall River residents had been excluded from serving on the jury, the majority of the jurors selected were tradesmen and farmers, given that the county's other towns were agricultural. Only one juror was an Irishman, most were Protestant, and a few even had daughters around Lizzie's age. All of them were men. Women weren't allowed to serve as jurors in Massachusetts until 1951,
So much for a jury of her peers. Gotta love the patriarchy.
and its longevity. The all male jury returned to the crowded courtroom in under 2 hours. The eager foreman said only, not guilty. At the news of Lizzie Borden's acquittal on June 20th, 1893, those in the courtroom, those jockeying for space in the corridors, and those still waiting outside the building burst into cheers. Lizzie, for her part, collapsed back into her chair and sunk her head onto the rail in front of her in relief.
Women's groups and much of the press approved of Lizzie's acquittal, and only 2 months later, after having inherited nearly $350,000 from their father, a sum that would add up to, wait for it, almost $10 million today, Lizzie and Emma took up residence in a Grand Victoria house located at 7 French Street in the Hill District, christening the stately home Maplecroft. But numerous residents and members of the Central Congregational Church were less than willing to welcome Lizzie back into the fold. Faced with both hostility and unabashed curiosity from other Fall River residents, Lizzie hoped confining herself to her house would be enough. Neighborhood kids, however, made that an impossibility with the many pranks they played on her.
Lizzie was then arrested in Providence on shoplifting charges in 1897, 4 years after being acquitted. After making restitution, she made trips to Washington, D.C., Boston, and New York to go to the theater and eat at expensive restaurants. But after Emma and Lizzie had an argument in 1904, Emma moved out of Maplecroft 1 year later. The Borden sisters never saw each other again over the following 2 decades. After this estrangement, Lizzie changed her first name to Lisbeth, and Emma moved to Fairhaven, Massachusetts, then later to Providence, Rhode Island. Even though Emma kept her home in Providence, she also started spending a portion of her final years in Newmarket, New Hampshire. Like Lizzie, she also took on a different name.
In June 1927, after living as a recluse with her dogs for company,
And there are worse things, I have to say.
true, Lizzie died at home. Emma, whose mother had made Emma promise to take care of her younger sister Lizzie on her deathbed, died 9 days after Lizzie at her home in New Hampshire. Both now rest beside Abby and Andrew. Over 100 years after the murders, the Borden house was converted into a bed and breakfast in 1996. Even though the Borden house was purchased for 1.8 million in May 2020, it was restored to its original style and decorated with real crime scene photos, and the bed and breakfast is still open to visitors today. I would definitely visit, but I am a wimp and definitely would not spend the night.
Same. I don't really think anything's still haunting the place, but I wouldn't want to take my chances.
You never know.
True. So, did Lizzie get away with murder? To quote the police marshal, judge, and district attorney at the time, probably. The night before the murders, Lizzie went to see her friend and confided in her that she was depressed and anxious about her father's numerous enemies. As she made her way to the door, her ominous parting words were, "I'm afraid something's going to happen."
How very smart of her planting that seed.
Absolutely.
Even with the lighter hatchet, how did Lizzie manage to overpower not only her stepmother, but also her father? And wouldn't she have gotten more blood on her even if she burned the dress she was wearing? Well, Abby had been felled with one blow to the base of her neck and killed with 18 more to the right side of the back of her head. As for Andrew, given his lack of defensive wounds, it's likely his attacker came upon him as he slept and bludgeoned him while they stood directly over him. It's possible that their murderer wouldn't have gotten much blood on them, especially if the victims were so surprised at being attacked by someone close to them that they didn't try and fight back. And since Abby was hit in the back of the head and Andrew was likely sleeping, neither was in much of a position to put up a fight against any type of attacker. Out of everything, what seems most likely is that the murders were driven by both hatred and money based on the brutality, and Abby having been killed first to ensure the inheritance went solely to the sisters.
However, another theory, which I don't personally subscribe to, is that Lizzie killed Abby and Andrew because Andrew had sexually abused her. It is, of course, true that incest, despite still being underreported, was even more so in the past. It has been alleged that due to the death of Alice, Lizzie's birth, and her poor health, sex with her husband wasn't Sarah's main priority, as it wouldn't be. Prostitution wasn't absent from Fall River, but Andrew was reportedly very private, and after Sarah's death, allowed Emma to take over the household duties rather than accept outside help, which allowed him to isolate the girls so he could abuse them. It's even been said that within the house at 92 Second Street, several upstairs rooms were locked and furniture was placed in front of the doors to prevent Andrew from getting into his daughter's rooms, a concession to Abby's suspicions of Andrew having been appropriate with both girls. I can't speak to the latter rumor, but the allegation that Andrew didn't allow outsiders into the house while the girls were young just isn't true. According to an 1860 census, When Andrew, Sarah, Emma, and Lizzie all lived at their previous home at 12 Berry Street, 19-year-old Caroline Gray was their live in servant. I guess you could say Andrew waited to abuse them until Sarah died, but if Abby was suspicious, why would he have married her if she prevented him from carrying on with the abuse?
I mean, it's interesting. I think that people would rather think that she killed Abby and Andrew because Andrew was abusing her and Abby didn't and couldn't do anything about it. She murdered them because they were evil, rather than that she hated Abby and was angry with her father for not providing her the lifestyle she expected and she wanted his wealth.
Justified revenge rather than greed would be a more palatable motive, especially for a woman.
Definitely. It's also been reported that none of the family members were especially close, except for Lizzie and Andrew when she was a teenager, that is. Andrew was said to have always worn a gold ring she presented him with after graduating from high school, and that this exceptional relationship was proof of sexual abuse, which seems like a reach.
I thought so too.
We certainly won't deny that the hatchet blows to his face indicated a deep rage, and the overkill with which Abby was murdered expressed a similar hatred. Some say Lizzie killed her too for either not being able to stop the abuse or for believing Lizzie was the one at fault.
And it's true that Emma and Lizzie could have moved out of the house to get away from the awful memories, but the fact that their new house was on the hill, the expensive part of town to which Lizzie had dreamed of moving, to me makes it seem more likely that money, like with Virginia and Verity, was the motive.
I mean, it sure seems that way.
With nothing reportedly stolen, it hardly seems likely that Abby and Andrew were victims of a robbery gone wrong, but Bridget and Lizzie were left unharmed. It is worth mentioning, though, that on June 24th, 1891, there had been a daytime robbery at the Borden home on 92nd 2nd Street, while Bridget, Emma, and Lizzie were all there. Speaking of her, what happened to Bridget after the murders? By 1897, she was living in Anaconda, Montana as a domestic servant. She married smeltman John M. Sullivan in 1905 and she died in 1948.
There have certainly been other suspects for the murders. For instance, some people reported seeing the same suspicious person, a wild eyed and red faced man, near the Borden's home on the morning Abby and Andrew were discovered. Those with grudges against Andrew were also considered, such as Henry Carter, who disagreed with Andrew about the bill for his water and rent. Seems like really quite the escalation.
That does.
A suitor of Lizzie's named David Anthony was also alleged to have committed the murders. There were also rumors that Andrew had an illegitimate son called Billy Borden, who decided to murder his father and stepmother, and Lizzie had helped him get away with it. George Fish, the husband of Abby's sister Priscilla Gray, even thought that Lizzie had teamed up with her Uncle John to hire an assassin. But even his own family believed that this was preposterous.
This is only a selection of the suspects, but in my opinion, with the mountain of evidence against Lizzie, each of these other people seem as unlikely as the rest to have been the one to kill Abby and Andrew. She simply got off because the male jurors could not believe that a respectable woman didn't just commit murder, but that she did so in such a physical, unfeminine way. What about you? Do you think Lizzie's guilty?
I mean, I do. I think the plethora of evidence, along with money being the motive, no sign of a break in, no evidence of stolen property. I mean, if you're going to cheat, not that a break in was set up, but people, if you are going to set up a break in, you're going to have to steal some stuff. Anyway, and moving to the hill so soon after the murders, I clearly points to Lizzie. I do wonder, do you think Emma immediately knew that it was Lizzie, or do you think Lizzie somehow threatened her? Or was she in denial? Was she scared that Lizzie would kill her too so she could have all the money to herself?
I don't think Emma was scared of Lizzie because she continued living with her, and I find it easier to believe that Emma was either in denial or quickly figured it out, and I lean more towards the latter given Emma's promise to her dying mother to take care of Lizzie.
I mean, that's a good point. I do have to say I really like that some people thought that it was Jack the Ripper, that really he came over from London and did this. ever how long it took to take the boat back to England. That's really great.
Well, I mean, imagine how many papers that would have sold.
Exactly. Okay, everyone, that's where we're going to end today. Next week, we'll be moving on to a new theme, celebrities killed by fans, starting with the case of Rebecca Schaefer. All the sources we use for this episode are in the show notes below. If you'd like to suggest a case or theme for us to discuss, feel free to email us at terrifyinglytypicalpodcast@gmail.com. You can also follow us at Terrifyingly Typical Podcast on Instagram and at Terrifyingly Typical Pod on TikTok. Leave us a comment below to let us know what you thought of the case. We'd love to hear your opinions.
See you next week.